Transcript. Rage, fear, and concealed power converge when a prejudiced officer crosses the line, assaulting a black pregnant woman in broad daylight. However, the following day, the entire town is shocked as the officer's life unravels, forcing him to confront the repercussions. What he didn't realize was that her husband is no ordinary man. This is a story of justice, secrets, and an unbreakable family bond. Stay tuned to discover how far a man will go to safeguard those he cherishes. It was a bright, sunny morning in Harrison, Arkansas. The sky was clear, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the tranquil streets. Jane stepped out of her lovely white brick home, her face radiant with a warm smile. She was a compassionate, nurturing, and affluent black woman, and today she had a special plan. Jane was several months pregnant, her belly round and heavy, yet she carried herself with elegance. Her husband David had been away on a business trip for days, and she was eager to surprise him with his favorite dinner upon his return later that evening. As she strolled down the street, she hummed softly, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a small shopping list. "You're going to love what I'm preparing for Daddy," she said gently, speaking to her unborn child. She lovingly rubbed her belly, feeling a gentle kick in response. Jane chuckled, her eyes sparkling with joy. "I knew you'd appreciate that." Jane cherished these brief walks to the store. Not only did it provide her with the physical activity she needed, but it also allowed her to enjoy the fresh air and greet her neighbors. The community knew her well and often waved as she passed by, their smiles mirroring her own. She walked at a slow, steady pace, careful not to overexert herself, yet feeling a sense of happiness and purpose with each step. The world felt serene, and she was content. As she neared the corner, Jane's thoughts drifted to the meal she was planning. She envisioned David's smile when he walked through the door, weary from his trip but thrilled to see the feast she had prepared. It had been some time since she had cooked a special dinner, and this was her way of expressing how much she missed him. But then the tranquility was shattered. A loud screech pierced the calm morning as a police car pulled up alongside her, its tires grinding against the pavement. Jane turned, startled, as the car's window rolled down, revealing Officer Kyle. He was a white officer new to the area, and he had quickly developed a reputation for being rude and unnecessarily aggressive. With a cold, stern expression, he glared at Jane, his eyes narrowing as if he had already deemed her guilty of something. "Stop right there!" Kyle commanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. Jane froze, confusion washing over her. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Kyle didn't respond to her question. Instead, he exited the vehicle, his gaze still locked on her. "I need to see your ID," he insisted, approaching her with a sense of authority that felt more intimidating than official. Jane hesitated, a flicker of fear igniting within her. "I'm just going to the store," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Why do you need to see my ID?" The officer's expression grew increasingly hostile. "Because I said so," he snapped. "You're acting suspiciously, and I want to know what you're doing out here." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. She had committed no wrongdoing, but the way he scrutinized her made her feel as though she was already guilty of something. Her heart raced, but she took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just heading to the store to pick up a few things." "Just show me your ID," Kyle shouted, cutting her off. Jane quickly rummaged through her purse and handed him her ID, hoping to de-escalate the situation. She could feel her hands shaking as she passed it to him, and she glanced around, noticing that a few people had begun to watch. The tension was thick, and it felt as if every breath was becoming harder to take. Kyle snatched the ID from her hand, glancing at it briefly, before shoving it back at her. "What are you really doing out here?" he inquired, his voice dripping with suspicion. Jane's eyes widened. "I told you, I'm just going to the store," she said, her fear shifting to frustration. "Can I go now?" But Kyle wouldn't let it go. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You think you can talk back to me?" he sneered. "You're acting like you have something to conceal." Jane's heart raced, and she could feel the tension escalating around her. "I don't have anything to hide," she insisted, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to go to the store." Then everything happened in an instant. Kyle suddenly raised his voice, shouting at her, accusing her of resisting. "Stop resisting!" he yelled, drawing the attention of more bystanders. Jane was stunned, her mind spinning. She hadn't done anything. She attempted to step back, raising her hands to indicate she posed no threat, but Kyle's aggression only seemed to intensify. Without warning, he lunged forward and shoved her. Jane stumbled backward, struggling to maintain her balance, but her heavy belly made it challenging. "Stop, please," she cried, but her words only seemed to infuriate Kyle further. He advanced again, and before anyone could react, he kicked her in the stomach. The force knocked her to the ground, and she gasped in pain, clutching her belly as tears streamed down her face. "My baby!" she gasped, her voice breaking. The world appeared to pause for a moment. There was only silence, and then chaos erupted. The onlookers rushed toward her, horrified by what they had just witnessed. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, while others tried to assist Jane, who was lying on the ground writhing in agony. Her hands cradled her belly, and she whispered, "Please, my baby, please be okay," repeatedly, as if attempting to comfort herself. Kyle, meanwhile, stood back, his face expressionless. "Everyone back off!" he yelled, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm handling this!" But no one was paying attention to him anymore. They were focused on Jane, their eyes filled with anger, shock, and disbelief. How could this happen? How could a police officer commit such cruelty, such senselessness? The sound of sirens echoed down the street, growing louder as an ambulance sped toward them. Jane's vision blurred as the pain became unbearable, but she could hear the voices around her, filled with fear and urgency. "She's pregnant! Be careful!" a woman said as paramedics rushed to her side. They quickly assessed her condition, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher as the ambulance doors closed, taking Jane away. The onlookers turned their attention to Kyle. He tried to maintain his authority, but it was evident that the situation had spiraled out of his control. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind a street filled with tension, fear, and the unanswered question that lingered in the air. Why? The tranquility of the morning was shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. The town of Harrison was typically quiet, but by the afternoon it was buzzing with outrage. The incident involving Jane had spread like wildfire. Videos taken by bystanders captured the horrifying moment when Officer Kyle kicked Jane, and the footage quickly made its way to social media. People from all over town and the country were sharing, commenting, and demanding answers. Hashtags like #JusticeForJane and #PoliceBrutality were trending, and the outrage was tangible. People were furious, their anger intensifying with each new detail they learned about what had happened to the pregnant woman who was simply on her way to the store. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense and urgent. Jane had been rushed to the emergency room, her pain unbearable, her mind clouded with fear and confusion. Doctors and nurses worked frantically around her, their voices calm but filled with urgency as they tried to stabilize her condition. Jane's heart ached not just from the physical pain, but from the terror that something might be wrong with her baby. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "Please let my baby be okay." A nurse gently held her hand, trying to comfort her as they prepared for an emergency C-section. Bashir, "We're going to take care of you and your baby, okay? You just need to stay strong." Jane nodded weakly, her body shaking, and prayed silently, hoping her little one would survive this nightmare. The doctors informed her that her placenta had detached due to the trauma, and she needed surgery immediately to save her baby. Not long after, the door to Jane's hospital room swung open, and Maria, Jane's best friend, rushed in. Maria's face was a mix of fear, anger, and worry. She had heard what happened and came straight to the hospital, her heart heavy with concern. "Jane!" she exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Oh my God, are you okay?" Jane tried to speak, but the pain made it difficult. "Maria, I'm so scared," she managed to whisper, tears glistening in her eyes. Maria took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm here, Jane. I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "We're going to get through this. You just need to focus on you and the baby right now." Jane nodded, but she couldn't shake the fear that was tearing her apart inside. Maria stayed by her side, even as the doctors wheeled Jane away for surgery, silently praying that everything would be all right. David, Jane's husband, was still on a business trip when he received the call. He was in a meeting when his phone buzzed, and he quickly excused himself, thinking it was just a routine update. But when he saw the name on the screen, Maria, his stomach dropped. Something was wrong. He picked up, and Maria's frantic voice on the other end told him everything he feared. "David, You need to get to the hospital right now. It's Jane. She's hurt, and they're performing surgery. David's world halted. He didn't wait for the meeting to conclude. He left immediately, rushing to the airport, his heart pounding with dread. Unknown to most, David was not just a businessman. He was a CIA operative, trained to remain calm under pressure, to think quickly, and act even faster. But as he hurried to catch the next flight back to Harrison, he felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. This wasn't a mission. This was his family. When David arrived at the hospital, he found Maria waiting for him, her eyes red from crying. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Maria led him to the waiting area outside the operating room. "She's in surgery," she said, her voice breaking. "They're trying to save the baby." David felt like he couldn't breathe. He sank into a chair, his hand trembling, and buried his face in them. "Who did this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Maria hesitated for a moment, then said, "A cop, Officer Kyle. He attacked her. I don't know why. People are talking about it everywhere. There are videos." David lifted his head, his eyes dark with a mix of sadness and fury. "Where's Kyle now?" he asked, his voice cold. Hours seemed to pass as they waited, and David felt like he was going to break apart. Finally, a doctor approached them, looking exhausted yet calm. "Mr. Williams," he said, and David stood up quickly. "Your wife is out of surgery. She's stable, but it was a difficult procedure. We managed to deliver your baby boy, and he's in the nursery now. But he's very small and will need to be monitored closely. It was a traumatic situation. But they're both fighters." David's legs nearly gave out as relief washed over him. "Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "She's still recovering, but you can sit with her." David entered Jane's room, and his heart ached when he saw her lying there, pale and weak but awake. "Jane," he whispered, sitting beside her and taking her hand. She opened her eyes, and when she saw him, she burst into tears. "David, I'm so sorry. I tried to protect him," she sobbed. David's eyes welled up, and he gently kissed her hand. "Shh, it's okay. You did everything you could. You're both going to be okay." But as he held her, his mind was already planning. He wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, David went to the police station, demanding to speak with someone in charge. But when he finally got a meeting, the conversation was infuriating. The officers were dismissive, insisting that Kyle was merely doing his job and that Jane must have misunderstood his intentions. "There's no clear evidence of misconduct," one officer said, as if the videos circulating online weren't enough. David clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his composure. "My wife did nothing wrong, and he assaulted her. There were witnesses." "There's video evidence." The officer shrugged. "The situation is still under review." Officer Kyle said she was resisting, and he acted within his rights. David's blood boiled. He had dealt with tough situations before, but this was different. This was personal. He knew then that the system wasn't going to assist him. It was clear they were protecting Kyle, and if he wanted justice, he'd have to find it himself. David left the station, his mind racing. He had spent years in the CIA dealing with dangerous individuals, managing crises, and uncovering secrets. But now he would use those skills to protect his own family. As he walked away, his phone buzzed with messages and videos from friends and strangers showing the incident from every angle. The world was watching, and so was he. David sent a quiet message back to his contacts, activating a part of his life he kept hidden. He returned to the hospital, quietly sitting beside Jane as she rested. She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and fear. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Everything's going to be fine," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. But deep inside, he was already planning his next move, knowing that Kyle would soon regret everything he did. Back at home, David was no longer the calm, gentle husband that everyone knew. The soft look in his eyes had been replaced with a steely determination. He sat at his desk, the room dimly lit, and began making a series of phone calls, his voice low and deliberate. Each conversation was brief, precise, and full of cryptic phrases that only those on the other end would understand. To anyone listening, it would sound like a foreign language, but to David, It was the language of his world, a world of intelligence, secrets, and power. As he hung up the last call, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating the next steps. David had spent years working undercover, gathering intelligence, and managing crises. He was trained to operate in the shadows, to be invisible when he needed to be, and he was more than capable of handling a situation like this. But this time, it wasn't about a mission. It was personal. No one threatened his family and got away with it. Through a series of flashbacks, the audience sees glimpses of David's past training sessions, where he learned how to track people without being noticed, moments where he gathered critical information using advanced technology, and missions where he had to outsmart the most dangerous of enemies. He was accustomed to playing a game of cat and mouse, but now he was the one setting the traps, and Officer Kyle had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Officer Kyle woke up groggy, his alarm blaring louder than usual. He rubbed his eyes, still feeling a bit disoriented, and dragged himself out of bed. As he opened his front door to retrieve the morning paper, he noticed several small envelopes and packages scattered on his doorstep. Frowning, he bent down to pick them up, thinking they were just misplaced mail. But as he tore one open, his heart skipped a beat. Inside was a collection of printouts detailing incidents from his past that he thought were long buried. Cases where he had abused his power, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from his record, and even confidential files that only someone with high-level access could obtain. There were also pictures of him in places where he didn't even realize he was being watched, as if someone had been tracking his every move. Kyle's hands shook as he read the last note, written in bold, threatening letters. "We know everything." He stumbled backward, his mind racing. How was this possible? Who could have obtained this information? He quickly glanced around, as if expecting someone to be watching him from the shadows. But the street was quiet, as normal as ever. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. Kyle hurried back inside, slamming the door shut, his breathing rapid and shallow. For the first time, he felt genuinely afraid. As the day progressed, Kyle's paranoia only grew. He attempted to go about his usual routine, but things kept going awry. When he went out to start his car, it refused to turn on, as if the engine had been tampered with. His phone kept glitching, shutting off and restarting at random, making it impossible for him to make calls. He even thought he saw the same unmarked car pass by his house multiple times, moving slowly, almost taunting him. Kyle's fear escalated to panic. He had always been the one in control, the one with power. But now it felt like someone was pulling all the strings, and he was just a puppet. He tried to dismiss it, convincing himself that it was all just a coincidence, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. Someone was targeting him, and they wanted him to know it. When he arrived at work, things only got worse. His fellow officers, who usually greeted him with nods of respect, seemed to avoid his gaze. He noticed them whispering to each other, casting sideways glances his way, as if they knew something he didn't. Kyle's unease grew with each passing moment, and it became clear that rumors were spreading. He tried to speak to his superiors, hoping to get some reassurance, but they were dismissive, barely acknowledging him. One of them even said, "You've made a mess, Kyle. I suggest you clean it up before it gets worse." That was all he received. No support, no backup. It was as if they were already distancing themselves from him, afraid of getting caught in the fallout. By evening, Kyle was at his breaking point. He sat alone in his living room, staring at the mysterious packages and letters that had turned his life upside down, his mind racing. But he couldn't find a way out. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? An enemy who seems to know everything about you, even your darkest secrets? And then his phone buzzed. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and saw a new message. The sender was unknown, but the message was simple, a video link. With a sense of dread, he clicked on it, and his screen was filled with a live feed of his own living room. The very room he was sitting in, but from a different angle, as if filmed by a hidden camera. Kyle's heart raced as the video panned around, showing every corner, every piece of furniture, before stopping at a note that had been placed on his coffee table. Kyle scrambled to pick up the note, his hand shaking so hard he could barely hold it steady. The words were clear and terrifying. "You messed with the wrong family. Make things right or the world will know everything you've done." Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever this was, they had been inside his house. They had gotten past all his locks, all his security, and they had left without a trace. It was a level of precision and control that he couldn't comprehend, and it left him feeling utterly exposed. He knew now that this wasn't just a random act of revenge. This was a calculated, meticulous attack by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Kyle's mind was spinning. He thought about calling the police, but what could he say? That he was being watched? That someone had entered his home without him noticing? Would they even believe him? Or would they just think he was losing his mind? And even if they did believe him, would they be able to stop whoever was behind this? The message was clear, and Kyle understood that this was his last chance. Whoever was targeting him had the power to destroy him, and if he didn't make things right, his life would be over. Panic surged through him, and he realized that he was up against someone far more powerful than he had ever imagined. But the question that haunted him was who? The suspense was building, and Kyle knew he was running out of time. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had only one option left. He had to find a way to make this go away, even if it meant confronting his own fears. But as the video feed on his phone went dark, he had no idea what his next move should be, and the feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Meanwhile, David sat in his office, his expression calm and composed as he watched the live feed disappear from his phone screen. He had given Kyle this warning, and now it was time to see if the man was clever enough to heed it. If not, David had plenty of other plans up his sleeve, and he wasn't afraid to execute them. The next day, the town of Harrison was buzzing with anticipation. News had spread quickly that Officer Kyle was going to hold a press conference, and everyone was eager to hear what he had to say. The videos of the incident had gone viral, and the town's residents, as well as people from all over the country, were watching closely, waiting for justice. Reporters gathered outside the police station, cameras set up, and microphones ready as the minutes ticked by. When Kyle finally stepped out, the crowd was stunned by his appearance. He looked pale, his eyes darting nervously across the faces in front of him, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. This was not the same confident, aggressive officer they had seen before. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was clear he was struggling. "I want to start by addressing the incident that occurred a few days ago," he began, his voice shaky. "What I did was wrong. I overstepped my authority, and I deeply regret my actions." There was a murmur in the crowd, people exchanging surprised glances. This was the last thing anyone had expected to hear. Kyle swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he continued. "I want to apologize to Jane Williams and her family. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and I am offering my resignation from the police force, effective immediately." The crowd erupted into whispers, the reporters frantically jotting down notes and flashing cameras, capturing every moment. No one knew what had brought about this sudden change of heart, but the relief on Jane's face was evident as she watched from the side, holding David's hand tightly. She had come to the press conference to confront the man who had harmed her, expecting to hear more excuses, but instead, she was hearing an apology. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she leaned into David, grateful but confused. As the press conference concluded, the reporters tried to ask Kyle more questions, but he quickly walked away, his face pale and drawn, leaving behind a storm of speculation. People wondered what had forced him to resign, but there were no clear answers. Whatever had happened, one thing was certain. Kyle's career was over, and Jane was finally receiving the justice she deserved now. After the press conference, David and Jane returned home, the tension of the past few days slowly beginning to lift. As they walked through their front door, Jane still couldn't believe what had transpired. "David, how did this happen?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. "Why would he just give up like that? I thought they were going to protect him." David smiled, a calm and reassuring expression on his face. "Sometimes people just need to see the consequences of their actions," he said gently, guiding her to the couch. He sat down beside her, holding her hand, and Jane could see that familiar look in his eyes, the one that always made her feel safe, even when things seemed chaotic. But there was something else behind that look, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "David," she said slowly, her curiosity getting the best of her, "I've always known that your job wasn't as simple as you said it was. You travel so much, and you're always getting these strange calls, but you've never told me exactly what you do." David's smile widened slightly, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You don't have to worry about that, Jane," he said softly. "My job is to keep you safe, to ensure our family is okay. That's all that matters." He squeezed her hand, and for a moment Jane felt a sense of peace. But the mystery surrounding David lingered like a shadow that refused to disappear. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had truly happened. But she also trusted him here. He had always protected her, and she knew he would do whatever it took to keep their family safe. Later that evening, after Jane had gone to rest, David sat alone in his office, his phone buzzing quietly on the desk. He picked it up and read the message that had just come through. "Everything has been taken care of. The reports are in, and higher authorities have been notified about Kyle's actions. He won't be able to hide from this." David nodded, his expression unreadable as he typed a brief reply. "Thank you." He put the phone down, but he didn't believe the office. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small metal box, setting it on the desk in front of him. He hadn't opened this box in a long time, but tonight felt different. As he lifted the lid, the contents were revealed. A collection of documents, badges, and small items that hinted at a life far more complex than anyone knew. There were photos from past missions, passports with different names, and encrypted devices that had been used to gather information. Among the items was a badge that bore the emblem of the CIA, along with David's real name and title. It was clear now that David was not just a businessman. He was a highly trained operative, someone with access to information and resources that few could ever imagine. The skills he had developed over the years had allowed him to manipulate situations, gather evidence, and ensure that those who crossed him would face the consequences. But Jane would never fully know the lengths he had gone to protect her, and he intended to keep it that way. As he closed the box and slid it back into the drawer, he glanced over at a photo of Jane on his desk. It was a picture of her smiling, taken on a sunny day when everything had seemed perfect. David reached out and gently touched the edge of the frame, his eyes softening. He knew that Jane deserved a life free of fear, and he was determined to give her that, no matter what it took. The story closes with David quietly walking into the bedroom where Jane was resting. She stirred slightly as he approached, opening her eyes and smiling at him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, sitting down beside her and gently placing his hand on her belly. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice calm and steady. "No one will ever harm our family again." Jane smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted back to sleep, comforted by his words. But as the camera panned away, the audience was left with the image of David's hand resting protectively over Jane's belly, a silent promise that he would always be there, watching, ready to act if needed. The final scene cuts to a dimly lit room where the small metal box is locked away in David's drawer, hidden from sight. The audience now understands the depth of David's capabilities, and while the mystery around him has been partially unveiled, there is still much left unsaid. It leaves a lingering sense of awe as viewers realize that the man who seemed so calm and ordinary was capable of extraordinary things, all for the sake of protecting the ones he loved. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. We hope this story moved you as much as it moved us, reminding us all of the strength, love, and resilience that can overcome even the darkest moments. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling content. We appreciate your support, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that captivate and inspire. Until next time, stay safe and take care.